Hello and welcome to Conscious TV. My name is Renate McNay and with me is Eleonora Gilbert, who is helping us with Conscious TV, and some of you probably know her already. With me in the studio is a panel which some of our viewers requested, and we have Richard Sylvester, we have Tim Freke and David Bingham, and all of them already have an interview with us on Conscious TV. And first we want to introduce the books of Richard Sylvester, I Hope You Die Soon, the Book of No One, and the third book is coming out, which I lost now. Would you like to mention?
Drink tea, eat cake.
Drink tea, eat cake.
Next spring.
Okay. And Tim has a book out, How Long Is Now, and Lucid Living, and a tape with it. And David is an artist, but the pictures are too big, so we cannot have them here. But are you actually going to write a book?
I am next year, actually, yes.
Yeah, good. So a lot of our viewers wrote in questions, and we will start with the questions.
Okay, so what happens after awakening?
So
Who would love to jump in and say, well?
Well, there is no awakening.
Wow.
Say more.
There is realization, but there is no awakening, because awakening implies a change of a state, but realization is realization of one's true nature, which has always been the case. So the idea that there will be awakening isn't true. For some, though, when one's true nature is seen really clearly, there can be a shift in the kind of functioning of the mind and the emotion, so it seems as though there is an awakening. But actually that's something that happens as a result. It's a kind of relief, a letting go in terms of the functioning of the mind. Not that there is anyone who is letting go, but there can be a change in the functioning of the mind, the emotions, in perceptions. So it seems as though there's awakening, but actually there is no awakening.
What do you think?
I don't mind the word awakening, I can live with that. But the thing which feels important to me is that there's the impression often that there's some place, you can get a badge, you've got it, well done, you have your badge, you can wear the t-shirt, you've got your certificate on the wall, realised. It certainly doesn't seem like that in my life adventure and what I've seen. It feels there's constant opportunity to expand, to discover, but what happens in that process as the deeper self is discovered, the place where there's one of us, is this love happens. There's a line, I've written a lot of book on Gnostic Christianity in my more scholarly historian role, and there's a line in one of the Gospels called the Gospel of Philip, where they talk about this awakening or realization as gnosis, as knowing. You know something. And there's this beautiful line where it just goes, those who are free because of gnosis become slaves because of love. And that's what, to me, captures completely what happens. That as you come back into this immense freedom, where it just is, then there's this connection in the separateness with everything and everyone. Right. And then there's this love. And you're propelled from love to live. And so, to me, that's the essential. Everything else carries on as before. I mean, certainly for me, the good things happen and bad things happen. Right. Good days happen and bad things. Some things work out, some things don't work out. Right. Some terrible things happen. Sometimes you suffer, sometimes you feel happy. Some days you're groggy, sometimes you're up, sometimes you're down. It's just life with all the polarities. But there's this background of love.
Right. So from the perspective of the personality, nothing much changes. Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm saying that, the fact of that love and that recognition of something means that kind of everything changes, in a way, because everything has a different colour to it. You've seen the background to something, which means that everything is in a new... You see the miracle of everything. You see the mystery of everything. Right. And and there's a safety. You know, in the Gnostic tradition, again, you know, in Christianity, you hear this phrase about being saved. Well, actually, in the Greek, in the Gnostic tradition, it's the discovery that you're safe.
Right.
That's what it's about. You experience the gnosis, and you know that you are safe, because you're not in this. It's in you. It's like a dream. When you discover you're the dreamer, you know that I know that Tim is safe. Well, not Tim is safe. What I am is safe. Tim's certainly not safe. He's incredibly vulnerable, actually. But it's okay that Tim is just very vulnerable.
Yeah.
And he's quirky. And he's got these funny things in him, like we all have.
Yeah.
Because what I am is safe. And so what I find is that the biggest difference for me is I'm actually able to engage with life, with the separateness. So whereas before I wanted to push it away because it was all so scary, the fact that it's scary is okay. And it still is scary.
Right.
But that's
okay.
all right.
Okay. No, you definitely answered the question. Yeah, definitely.
Well, I'd start in a way by saying we could say there is no such thing as awakening, because ultimately it's seen that being awake and being asleep are the same thing. But nevertheless, I use the word, I mean, it's just language, but I use the word awakening for when there's a sudden glimpse of oneness, a sudden glimpse of how things are when there is no separated person there to see everything, if you like. Because often that happens and then the person comes back.
Yes.
And I use the word liberation, not that it's particularly meaningful, for when the person falls away and doesn't come back.
Mm-hmm.
In a way you could say that makes no difference, and in a way you could say it makes, you know, all the difference in the world. And I'm not the first person to use the phrase, you know, nothing is changed and yet everything is transformed. You know, nothing is changed because everything just goes on as before. You know, this glass of water goes on being a glass of water, feelings go on arising, thoughts go on arising, perceptions go on arising, and yet now they're not arising for anyone.
Right.
And so nothing changes, but the transformation is that the nothing that is not changing is now no longer happening for a person. And it's that which, if you like, reveals everything as magical, reveals everything as a miracle.
You're reminding me of a quote from one of our teachers, Hamid, who says that the finite and the infinite are inseparable. Is that what you're referring
Well,
to?
both inseparable and indeed the same thing.
Right. Yes.
So the next question then is, and somehow you already answered that, is self-realization the end of suffering? You know, some people we all think, I want to get enlightened or self-realized to end this suffering.
Yeah, well, I don't feel that.
You don't feel
I don't feel that.
Yeah.
You know, my dad died last year, and he suffered a lot. He was paralysed, he could move one arm, and he just lay in that bed going, help, help, help. I wanted to suffer with him. I did not want to be so cut off from my humanity that I was sitting there going, well, it's all one, nothing really matters, it's all just a dream, da-da-da-da-da. But to be lost in the suffering would have been too much. Mm-hmm. But to be in this place where I can see this poignancy, where there is a deep sense in which it's all right. It really is. And yet also within the play, within the drama, your heart can break. And the most awful things can happen. And you can be right there with that, and it hurts. It hurts so hard that you're just tearing you open. And that feels to me what love is. You see, love is not just a good feeling. Love is also, you know, God, when you love, you know, when I remember my little girl when she would sleep, when she was very young, and normally she would snore very loudly like me, but sometimes she would be hardly breathing, and you just, that moment, and that, when you love, you care. It's so deeply, and there is suffering in that caring. So for me, it's not about losing that. In fact, actually, it's daring to enter into that, to enter into how vulnerable we are, how frightening life is. And the only way that we can do that, or the way I can do that, is when I have this knowledge of the other polarity of my nature, which is safe, which is like just there, just a place where it's just and still. And then the two dance together. So the suffering hasn't gone anywhere, because suffering is one of the poles of life. It's not going to go.
It just reminded me a quote of the same teacher. Without heart, enlightenment is dry and cruel.
Yeah, really, and cold. It's a very cold.
Yeah,
You can,
yeah.
if you just get this, I'm a witness, or you just get it's all one, or this is an illusion. You can enter into a very deep, depersonalization is a clinical, psychological problem. I mean, I have someone very close to me right now who's very young who is suffering from depersonalization, and it is hell because this isn't formed. It's when we have both that it can really open up into this into this expansion of consciousness. So you're feeling more alive, not less alive. You haven't retreated to this place where you're just, look, I'm not attached. Who would want to be not attached?
Yeah.
David,
I agree with Tim in terms of love. What I'd like to say about self-realization is that many people seeking self-realization are actually seeking an end to suffering.
yes.
And self-realization is missed because they think that self-realization is going to be an end to suffering. The simplicity of noticing one's true nature has actually always been there, can't be accepted sometimes. And, you could say, well, actually, because it's the self that reveals itself to itself, you could say that there isn't anything that the person can do to facilitate that anyway. But I think making the distinction between self-realization and the end of suffering is really important to people who appear to be seeking.
Yes.
What I'd also say about suffering is, what I've played with is, what I feel about experience in terms of the way it's kind of spinning for an individual is, it's as though the beliefs we hold about particular topics seem to be there in front of us. So if you have a deep investment in the idea of suffering, what I've noticed is there's more of it, and there's more of that resonance that comes in. So if you're holding either on a conscious or a subconscious level the idea of suffering, then more of that is coming in. When you make the choice, or the apparent choice, to see things in a different way, you realise that you're kind of looking at history in a way. The way what we're experiencing is to do with the beliefs that we've held. But what I've noticed is when we actually change the beliefs that we're holding, you find that quite often there's the resolution to that suffering. And it can be in terms of a witnessing quality, but it can also be on a practical level. You see that the scenery around you, where the suffering appears or is appearing, actually changes. And ultimately what you know is that there is nothing happening anyway. So it's only when we're entering into the dream or into the waking state, there appears to be suffering, there appears to be this story going on, there seems to be the passage of time, where there can be not suffering, then not suffering, or more suffering. All of that is happening in the virtual reality. But that needs to be known, it needs to be realised that we've invested a particular kind of perspective. And because what we ultimately are is a field of infinite possibilities, one of the possibilities is to experience suffering. And because consciousness will whip up whatever we wish to experience, it'll present it to us in a way that is most convincing, most believable, and we can have that full experience of suffering. But actually, on one level, not as the individual, but in terms of a more kind of expanded level, on, say, a causal level, that suffering is there because there's some level on which we've invested in that.
Right.
So to me, you could say, well, there's nothing you can do about the suffering. What I've noticed on a practical level is when you withdraw the investment in suffering, in the reality of suffering, then actually it begins to dissipate. And that's something that can change. That's something that can, in my experience, and I can only talk about my experience. My experience is when you withdraw the idea of there being suffering, or that suffering is a part of one's experience, then it's fluid, as it is with happiness. If you want to introduce more happiness, so, there are levels at which there seem to be kind of programming that comes in that is predetermining certain limitations of experience, but there does within the play also appear to be the opportunity to amend the programming to some degree, and quite often it depends on the sense of will that you have. If you feel that there's nothing you can do, well, there'll be nothing you can do. What I've noticed is sometimes there's this absolutely powerful will that comes in, and no matter how big that obstacle appears, it just gets smashed out of the way, because this almighty will that isn't the will of the individual comes in, and it just absolutely decimates it.
Yeah. Wonderful. Okay, that's very clear.
Fascinating.
Richard, what do you think?
Well, firstly, I'd say that I think the idea that there is such a thing as personal liberation, which will bring about the end of personal suffering, is an incredibly seductive idea. I mean, it's easy to see why it should be so attractive. And it is a complete myth. I think in liberation, I'll use that term, unsatisfactory though it is, it's quite possible that suffering might increase rather than decrease. And I think there are sort of fairly obvious reasons for that, because I think the separated individual often has some very good ways or tricks for toning down suffering. You know, I mean, the neurotic individual is very often very good at toning down suffering.
Right.
So when that kind of control is no longer there, then everything is simply more raw.
Yes.
And this has been called, living life with the blinkers off. So the blinkers off means the blinkers off everything.
Yeah.
So just as maybe this is suddenly seen in its reality, then suffering may be experienced in its full force.
In its rawness.
I mean, there are, again, I mean, this is a bit psychological, I don't want to go on about this too much, but I think there are also reasons why perhaps suffering may be stronger but more short-lived when the person is no longer there, because the neurotic personality is very good at toning down suffering but prolonging it.
Yes.
And so, for example, instead of a flash of anger, the neurotic person might experience 2 days of irritation. So if that's no longer there, instead of 2 days of irritation, a flash of anger instead. But any idea that, while there's a psychophysical organism alive on the planet, suffering can somehow be avoided other than through means which are quite unhealthy is just completely false. I mean, there are ways of avoiding suffering, of course there are, but they tend to all have a very high price. I mean, developing detachment is a good way of toning down suffering, but at the cost of living life. Taking heroin is a very good way of toning down suffering, but equally it has a very obvious cost as well.
Right.
Yes. But there's something more fundamental as well I wanted to say. You were quoting this teacher of yours, and I suddenly remembered something of Nisargadatta's that I like very much. And it goes back to this, this distinction between this sort of brief glimpse of how things, if you like, really are, and then that view of things when the person goes away and doesn't come back. And Nisargadatta says that seeing that I am nothing is wisdom, and that's what I would call awakening. In awakening you see that you are nothing. Indeed, you see that everything is nothing and everything arises from nothing. But it's a kind of, and it does bring a considerable degree of wisdom in a way, but it's a kind of cold and empty seeing in a way. Right? And then Nisargadatta goes on, seeing I am everything is love. And in realization, if you like, or liberation, it's seen not just that I am nothing, but that I am also everything, and everything is me. And that's what suffuses life, existence, whatever word, being, whatever word you want to use. That's when it is realized that everything is love. And maybe that's also why, after awakening, the neurotic personality often comes back in full force, and after awakening, things are even worse than they were before. Whereas liberation is the end of all of that, because when it's seen that I am love and there is only love, there isn't really anything else to be done or anywhere else to go.
Well, the person still will come back, or try to come back. or is when liberation happens, does this eradicate the ego structure?
Well, again, it's only language, but the description. I mean, this is just a description of something. The description that I would give is that is when the person falls away and the fullness.
Yes.
It's a very paradoxical phrase, but the fullness of nothing is seen, if you like, that it's seen that nothing is full of love or consists of love. That's the end of the person, and the person doesn't come back after that. But what difference that makes, well, we could talk about that for a long time. It might make no difference at all. It might make very little difference, because although the person doesn't come back, life goes on.
Yes.
Everything about life goes on. Feelings and thoughts and perceptions and glasses of water still go on. The adventure doesn't stop.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah.
We come full circle in a sense.
That's a metaphor that's often used, that we come back to the place that we started from and see it for the first time, see it for what it really is. In other words, there is a realisation that we seem to have gone on a journey, but actually there's been no journey at all, because we never moved from where we were.
Okay. I have another question, which is kind of, well, I call it quirky, but it may not be quirky, but some people seem to believe that you can actually trigger awakening by stimulating the right part, the right side of the brain.
Do you want us to try it?
Well, but I was specifically, let me read the question anyway. Can experience of non-duality be simply understood as a pure right brain experience? And where this question comes from is, I don't know if you've heard about the stroke of insight as explained by Jill Bolte.
Yeah.
Right, so I was just wondering if you had a comment or an opinion about that. Anyone?
I have no idea. That's easy for me to answer. I mean, the brain is clearly, the vehicle through which we experience all this. You whack your brain in certain ways, you'll have certain things happen. I have a friend who almost died recently, and another one who has, by having bleeds on the brain. The brain is very important. And what that lady expresses is very interesting and deep, and she clearly understands about the brain, and I think what she has to say is fascinating and very, very inspiring. What you really see, though, there, whether it is to do with left brain, right brain, is this thing of polarity that just informs the whole of life. There is always these two poles. So what we do with that is just go, okay, so there's this one which breaks everything up, part of the brain, and there's another which sees how everything's connected, part of the brain. Well, that reminds me very much of the Nisargadatta quote, which, funnily enough, I've got on a T-shirt and almost wore today, which would have been fun. Which is the same thing. Here is the one side, which is like what he calls wisdom or emptiness, or whatever word name you give for that, and then there's the love, which is the manyness of things. D.T. Suzuki says the same thing. Wisdom is the oneness of things, compassion is the manyness of things, is what he says. So that it's embodied in our physicality in some way would not surprise me, because it seems to be in everything else.
Right.
But if you go back to the original question, just the first part of it.
Okay, can the experience of non-duality be simply understood as a pure right brain experience?
That wasn't the first part of the question, was it? It was.
Oh, okay, well, I thought...
Was
sorry,
it?
The very first question at the beginning?
No, the very first part of that question, I thought, was,
can experience of non-duality be simply understood as a pure
I
right
thought it
brain
was, could it be
experience?
stimulated by...
Well, no, but then I added on to, can
Yes.
it actually be, by stimulating the right part
Yes,
of the brain,
that's
can
the
it
bit I
actually
was
be
trying to home in
elicited?
on, yes.
Right.
That's a very cute story, and I mean there are many, many, many cute stories about how usually these questions revolve around the idea that this is an experience, so how this
see.
experience
I
can
see.
be brought about
Okay.
by some sort of stimulation of some part of the
Yeah.
brain, or the ingestion of some kind of particular hallucinogenic plant or something like that. And these are very, very attractive stories, because we want to be able to do something, but they are just stories. They are cute stories, because this isn't about an experience.
Right, okay.
And
For most people, that's actually the final obstacle, because the story for most of us is we start off, in life, and we're really completely absorbed in the story. So there's a person having a drama with whatever it is, family issues or whatever it is, and then quite often there's some sort of spiritual seeking that comes in, and then with the spiritual with the spiritual practice comes spiritual experience and the conviction that self-realization is going to be an experience. So for most people that contact me are convinced that they're having these experiences, and when they all kind of join together, there's this permanent state that's going to be created, which is self-realization. But that, as Richard says, it isn't, self-realization isn't an experience. Self-realization is the knower, and the experience is the content of knowing. So really, it's overcoming that. But in terms of the question, what I would say is that the nature of self-realization is, because it is a field of all possibilities, there isn't one way that it can happen. So that it's perfectly possible that by doing this or doing this or whatever it is, there could be self-realization, because anything can trigger it. But actually, I mean, for most people that I've spoken to, and in my experience, there's an acceleration that happens. You're kind of plodding along, you're doing your meditation, you're going to work, and then there's an intensity comes in, and usually the whole thing collapses. I was talking to Richard, and he said, I had a similar experience. You're completely devoted to this particular teaching, and then you realise something's going on, and then you just have to let go of that. The complete devotion completely collapses, and then there's this kind of open space, and then from there, quite often there's an acceleration where there's this kind of inner knowing that comes in that begins to kind of take you in the direction, but it isn't you that's doing it. It appears that they're choices that you're making as an individual that are taking you closer and closer. But when it's clearly seen, it's seen that it was the self revealing itself to itself. It wasn't the individual that was doing it. It was just going by itself.
I feel like adding also to my answer, the question is, can we, if you like, attain this through stimulating the right brain? I feel like saying, well, I wish, if we could, I'd go and buy the electric box and hire it out to people for sessions.
It is available on the internet.
I'm sure it is, and many other things as well. If only it was so simple.
Yeah. Okay.
It's even more simple than that, actually, because you don't need a box, because it's already the case.
The brain is the box.
Yes. Yeah.
I'll tell you later.
Another question somebody wrote in was, why do people awaken more and more these days?
Would one of you guys like to
Well,
answer that?
my first answer to that is we can't know that that's the case. I mean, it's often said that that's the case. I think the mind, again, is fantastically attracted to evolutionary stories. We just love these stories that we are going somewhere, or the planet's going somewhere, the human race is going somewhere, and sometimes these stories are to somewhere glorious, like an age of enlightenment, or sometimes they're somewhere apocalyptic, and often a combination of both, where people like me will go somewhere glorious and my enemies will be wiped away in a great apocalypse. I mean, the mind finds these stories so absolutely fascinating. And I mean, that question kind of merges with, a lot of the stories of evolution at the moment around the idea of an age of enlightenment, or some great shift in consciousness, or something happening in 2012 and so forth. And my starting point would be saying, well, firstly, these are all stories. And secondly, how can we know? We can't know, because how do we know how many times, if you like, to speak in these terms, this has been seen, realization has been seen? How do we know how many people see through the appearance and never talk about it? Or they talk about it once, perhaps, to their family, and then learn very quickly that they better not talk about it anymore because they're getting very strange looks. I'm contacted sometimes by people whose families have quite seriously suggested that they see a psychiatrist. Because, basically what they're describing is what we're talking about here, but to the family it sounds like they become psychotic, so they learn very quickly to shut up. Or how many people do we know never talk about this simply because they don't have the character of a communicator. They're not just not that sort of person. Or going back into history, pretending for a moment that there is such thing. I mean, for large amounts of time, and still now on the planet in many places, it would be fantastically dangerous to talk about this. If you talked about this in the Middle Ages, you would have been executed by, burned at the stake by the Inquisition, and people were, and we know cases where people were. So in a sense, I kind of am a bit suspicious about this whole, this whole idea. It's becoming more popular to talk about this, it's becoming more acceptable, and it's becoming safer. And I would tend to leave it at that.
So maybe both are true in the sense that if I think about how many books are available nowadays on this subject, and even 30 years ago when I started looking at things, I couldn't find as many books as there are now. So perhaps in that sense where we were coming from is, there are more and more people that seem to be awakening and talking about it and writing books about it.
And there's a movement towards something. I mean,
Or
we can call
even
it evolution or awakening.
But even the idea of having a conscious TV, for instance, that's to me
And
stems from.
meanwhile, here we are, and this is it. And this is the totality. And in this totality, thoughts arise of stories of evolution because they're fascinating and they're very attractive. And still all there is this. And here we are.
But Richard, do you feel that, to me, the distinction needs to be made between that which never changes, because what we truly are, there is no evolution, because our true nature is unchanging. But in terms of the appearance, in terms of the stories, there can be a story of evolution. So in the relative, you can move the kind of absolute nature of unchanging into the stories, and you can have a story of unchanging, but also you can have a story of evolution. And to me, the relative nature, to use an Indian term, Leela Shakti, which is the play power of the divine, the nature of the appearance of the waves on the ocean, whatever you want to call it, that's the entertainment. So, it's making the distinction between knowing that one's true nature, once it's seen, can't evolve. It never has evolved. But there can be the story of evolution, and that's entertainment. And within that, there can be experiences that evolve. My experience has been that, there is less and less suffering. And there is more empowerment, and there are more possibilities. The way that's happened is as a result of surrender. Now, surrender implies duality. Surrender implies that there's a person who can surrender. But the surrender I'm talking about makes the distinction between knowing that what you truly are, the infinite being, can't surrender because you can't, there's no one to surrender. But there's the apparency of the person who thought he was doing something. When he realizes he can't do anything, you could call that surrender, because then the infinite intelligence just comes through and it's just doing its own thing. So it's just that it appears as though there's a person who can amend the flow, and then it appears as though that person can step out of the way, and then the flow just comes through. And it depends on whether there are beliefs in the story that there are these subconscious programs that are impeding the flow or not. Right. And you can play with the idea that you either remove them or leave them in place. Or, all of that's just a daft game. Yeah. But it's good fun. Yeah. So it depends on whether you want to engage in the fun, engage in the game, or you want to dismiss that as something as being, something not worth entertaining.
Well, I'm just thinking about, the fact that there are lots of people that are actually thinking that unless we change and become a little bit more conscious, there is no,
way that we will survive.
Yeah, no hope in surviving. So from that perspective, I was actually thinking in terms of, maybe we are evolving. If there are more and more people that are conscious about this stuff and at least talking about it or writing about it. But what you're saying is that it's a nice story, and
who knows? You can look at it.
I think it's more than that.
You think it's more than a
I mean,
story?
it's all stories. We got
Yes.
anything in concepts can't be anything else. But the tone of voice in which we say that is crucial. If we say it's just a story in a dismissive way, then it's kind of like, well, it's just a story. Well, it is a story for sure. That's all that concepts can be. But let's look at what we have here. Everything is this. This is the way it looks to me. That this is the evolution of consciousness. The forms are evolving to reveal the essence. If we look at this grand narrative that science has provided us with now, which is just awesome, from the singularity coming into form, and through that form coming into greater and greater consciousness until here we are with the possibility of self-consciousness, that we are conscious and we know that we're conscious. We are the universe looking at itself, conscious that we exist, with the opportunity to now pay attention to that knowledge that we exist. And when we do, we connect back with that thing which was there before the singularity. We become back with that essence which is being revealed through the forms. And we're all on that journey.
Yes.
I mean, I've been on that journey. When I came into this, I was a little tiny thing and my consciousness was completely different. And I've learned all of these concepts and had all these experiences, and then it started to reveal itself to me. And here I am now, a bit older, a bit fatter, a bit, bolder. But yet through all of that process, through that evolution, I've seen things which I didn't see before. And we're doing that collectively. Now, if we knock out, to me, this crazy idea that there's somewhere where you arrive, call it anything, and get rid of that. And just say, look, we are consciousness evolving through these forms, becoming conscious of itself. It looks infinite to me. I don't see why there's any limit to that. So are more people arriving at the benchmark where they've got it? That's irrelevant. Who knows? But what's happening is that consciousness can't help but evolve, because time is evolution. The thing about time is the present moment contains the past.
Yes.
So all of that's been before is here now, within what's happening now. So it's expansive. By its very nature, time is expanding. Consciousness is expanding. It can't help do it. So what we're being able to see and do and connect with now is so much more than it's ever been before. Now, whether that means we're going to reach a golden age in 2012, I wish, but I have my doubts. I think we're probably on a very, very, very long journey here. But that it's a journey that is evolving in some way seems really important, both personally and collectively. And here's the thing which I want to add, if I may, which is that we do this, and the paradox is we do that through the process of individuation. It's actually not just by getting rid of the person, that it's actually by becoming more of an individual. The thing which the thing which brings anyone to watch a program like this or be part of this is that you've thought for yourself. You've come up through this unconscious thing of your culture, and then you've become conscious and gone, do I think that? Can I doubt that? Let me look for myself. You've individuated. You become more separate, which is why people, as they start to awaken, often find themselves on their own.
Yes.
Because other people, it's like they're not with the herd. They're becoming more conscious. And you individuate. So the irony is that you have to become more of a someone to recognize the one.
Right.
And rather than seeing this as something which needs to go, the person, the ego, the separate self, I feel more it's the foundation through which we're awakening to the one. So we become individuals, we come into the separateness in order to discover this. But through it, that's why it's so precious. This is why this is so amazing. Because without this, we're just not conscious at all.
Can I add something as well to what I said? I think as separated individuals, we are fascinated by stories, and in a way, the more complex the stories become, the better. We can see this with religions, for example, how fantastically complex these become. Now, the description from here of what we're talking about, of whatever it means to say, when oneness is seen or whatever, that description is, from here, is that life then tends to get very simple. An awful lot of the complexities fall away, because the stories fall away. And I was talking to somebody a few weeks ago, someone where I feel, this is pretty clearly seen, and she was saying to me, she said, Richard, people use this expression, watching paint dry, to indicate sort of life being boring. She said, I really like watching paint dry. And I just said, I know exactly what you mean. I really, in fact, I would even go so far as to say I like watching paint that's already dried. Life has become kind of that simple. And so in a way, if I just gave a very simple description and kept any kind of theorising out of it, all I can say is that at least here, a fascination with these stories of evolution and what will happen in 2012 and the age of enlightenment and are we evolving and da-da-da-da-da. All I can really say is that a fascination with all of that has just gone. I would rather watch paint dry, I'd rather watch paint that's already dried, I'd rather go round my local park and feed the ducks than read a book about the coming age of enlightenment. A simple description.
Yeah.
Exactly, that's simpler.
We are missing the present moment by just getting carried away with all the story.
You could say that, because all of these stories are about looking for something better than this in some other place, in some other time.
Yes.
But
And
Richard,
that's what the mind
don't you
is
think?
always
Don't you think
doing.
these two sit together? Because it seems to. I mean, I know exactly what you mean, and I find it very hard to read any books these days. I shouldn't say that because I'm an author and I want people to read my books. But I don't. It's like I can't engage with that in the same way that I used to when I was hungry for it. And I know what you mean. The simplicity. I love it when I get the chance to just sit and just God, it's precious. And that simplicity. God, it's all about that simplicity. And yet also I can see, and yet life is infinitely complex too. And granular in every direction. And the more you look into any one area, the more fascinating it unfolds. And the individuals are doing that in every direction. Some people are doing it in ways, with golf or with, with science or with, and it's exploring all of these things. I'm like you, really. I'm drawn to, I just want to do the simple thing. But that all of those things are happening. And that's,
Oh, they're definitely happening,
and that's
yes.
great. That's really good. It's not like I can't prejudice one over the other.
I'm certainly not suggesting that everybody should sit and watch dried paint. No, I'm just saying that for me and a few other people, that seems to be
right.
That seems to be satisfying enough.
I don't see a conflict. It's really just about how you wish to experience. Really, there is no right or wrong. If you want to watch paint dry, or if you don't, if you want to consider the theory of evolution or what your part is within that, or your relationship to God or whatever it is, it's perfectly valid. I love the line in the Course in Miracles which says everything only has the meaning that you give to it. Nothing in itself has any meaning. Everything is actually neutral until you give it a meaning.
Yes.
And so, if you say that it's really important that you just see it this way, well, if people wish to just see it this way, I'm absolutely easy with that. But if someone wants to see it in another way, I'm easy with that. And I'm not saying that this is better or worse or more truthful or less truthful, because the nature of it is that it's infinite. So why would we want to limit it in any way? It's just really, it's about what resonates. Watching paint dry resonates for some people. For others, it doesn't. They want to be using the paint, or they want to be writing a book, or they want to be doing something else.
Because David must. You're a painter, so you must do a lot of watching paint dry.
That has made me wonder. That has made me wonder whether we're going to get to the question about the meaning of life that you were discussing before the filming started.
And we are really running out. We've got at least another 3 minutes. So there are two.
Oh, we can do the question of the meaning of life in 3 minutes.
42. We all know that, don't we?
Right, okay, so what is the meaning of life?
In a minute each.
Yes, and then I also wanted to ask you about the marketing thing, that everybody seems to be jumping on this bandwagon of, the enlightened teachers. So let's see what we can do.
In a nutshell, the meaning of life?
So
Well, like David said, like a dream. What's the meaning of a dream? It's the meaning you give to it. It's so full of meaning. It's infinite meanings. But if you took mine, I would say it seems that the potentiality has become two, the manifest, on a journey to discovering that it's one. So the one becomes two to know that it's one. And that sounds a bit dry. You can say the same thing. The one becomes two to love itself. And on some deep primal archetypal level, that says something to me.
Right.
That mythos.
Okay.
I would say life has no meaning, which is the same as saying it needs no meaning, which is the same as saying life is its own meaning. I don't know if that beautiful pot plant is in shot or not, but that pot
It is.
plant does not need a meaning
Yeah.
to be a perfectly adequate pot plant, and we do not need a meaning to be perfectly adequate apparent individuals.
David.
Which one do you want first? The meaning of life, or?
Oh, whichever strikes you.
Okay. Well, I'll answer them both quite quickly.
Okay.
The meaning of life to me really is starting from the point of infinity,
Yes.
and then what we've all done is we've brought the boundaries in, and we've brought the boundaries in to here actually, and we can either choose to keep the boundaries here or we can move them out again, and it depends on where you want to put the boundaries, but everyone is able to do that, not as an individual, but in terms of the potential that we have as the infinite being, which is our true nature. And quickly to answer the other one,
Yes.
what I feel about spiritual teaching is, my approach is that I don't wish to impart anything to anyone particularly. I just tend to respond to what happens. The story I told before about, sending all the CDs out to John Wheeler, because I thought if everybody heard them there would be self-realization, and then realizing that, actually that's a complete waste of time. But there is an intelligence that comes through you that will facilitate everything, and it's really just being alert. It's just, to me, it's just responding to what's here.
Yeah.
So if somebody says, do you want to come down and have an interview, and be with Tim and Richard and spend the afternoon? Yes, I'll do that. I love it. It's been great fun. I've really enjoyed that.
Yeah.
Tomorrow will be something else, but really it's just about responding to what's here. It isn't about selling
Right.
anything. I'm not
Right.
trying to sell a philosophy, sell any books,
Yes.
I probably will try to sell some books. But it's really just responding to what happens rather than to seeking some particular outcome.
One final word
Was this the question about the marketing? Did we
about
get
the
on to
marketing.
that?
Yes, that's right.
I'd give a similar answer. There's no agenda whatsoever. It's just that, this is what's happening. There was a voice over the phone or an email, an invitation, a response here. Thought, well, sounds kind of fun. And now this is happening. And if this wasn't happening, something else would be happening. I'd probably be feeding the ducks in my local park. I don't know. But, there's no agenda. There's no purpose. I am not a teacher. There's nothing here that either wants other people to get anything, and there's nothing here that believes that anybody else could get anything from anything I say or write.
Yeah.
This is just life happening, meaninglessly and beautifully.
Quickly, because we need to stop.
Yes, I agree with all of that. It just happens somehow. You end up in this strange predicament where it starts to become a commodity because it's being pushed by a publisher, and everyone has to shout louder than everyone else because no one gets heard.
Yeah.
And it's all crazy that this very precious thing is in this mad world.
Yes.
And yet, through all of that, I know, well, for me, same as I spoke to these guys, people came to me and said, look, I don't want to read about this. You write books.
Yeah.
I want to experience
Yeah.
it. And there is nothing sweeter for me. It's when I'm most. It just feels the best, is to be with someone or a group of people and enter into that big love together.
Great.
It's just the best. It's-
Okay.
So, unfortunately, we have to stop. I feel we just got really warmed up. And, thank you for coming, guys.
Thank you.
And just to mention, this was the second part of the panel. The first part we did earlier. So watch out for the first part. And thank you for watching Conscious TV, and we will see you soon. Bye-bye.